The morning Opal Ellsworth climbed out of the second-floor window of the Beaumont Hotel in Wichita, Kansas, dragging a carpet bag and 3 years of swallowed silence behind her. She made herself a promise she intended to keep until her dying breath. She would never again let a man speak for her. It was the spring of 1878, and the Kansas plains were still cold enough at dawn to bite through a wool dress. Opal had not slept in 2 nights. She had spent those hours lying perfectly still beside her husband, Walter Beaumont, listening to him breathe the slow and satisfied breath of a man who believed he owned everything he could see, and waiting for the single window of time when the night staff changed shifts and the stable hand stepped away for his morning coffee. She had planned it down to the minute. That was what nearly 3 years of marriage to a man like Walter Beaumont did to a woman. It made her meticulous, because the cost of a single mistake was too high to calculate. Walter was not a violent man in the way that left marks. He was the other kind, the kind who wore you down so slowly and so completely that by the time you understood what was happening, you could barely remember who you had been before him. He was 41 years old and had run the Beaumont Hotel since inheriting it from his father, and he treated Opal with the same precise, managerial coldness with which he managed his property. He told her what to wear and what to say and whom to speak to and whom to ignore. He corrected her in public so gently that everyone around them thought him a considerate husband. He took her opinions and quietly set them aside, the way a man sets aside a child's drawing acknowledged, then forgotten. He had wanted a wife who was decorative and agreeable, and for a long time Opal had tried to be exactly that, because she had been 22 years old and newly arrived in Wichita from a small farm in Missouri, and she had believed, the way young women are taught to believe, that being chosen by a prosperous man was the finest thing that could happen to her. She had been wrong. She understood that now, stepping down off the hotel's lower roof overhang and dropping the last 4 feet into the alley below, landing in cold mud and not caring at all. She had $42 saved from the household money Walter allotted her for small expenses, a change of clothes, a small derringer her older brother Silas had given her years ago with strict instructions never to show it to anyone, a folded letter from a woman named Mrs. Hargrove in a town called Ember Creek, Colorado, who was looking for a woman of reliable character to help run a boarding house, and the iron-hard conviction that she was not going to die in a hotel room smelling of Walter Beaumont's pomade. The Santa Fe Railroad line ran south out of Wichita, but the stage depot ran west, and west was the direction of Colorado. Opal used 8 of her $42 on a stagecoach ticket that would carry her as far as Dodge City, and from there, she planned to find another line heading toward Pueblo. She sat in the stagecoach with her carpet bag pulled tight against her ribs and watched Wichita disappear behind the flat edge of the horizon, and she felt something she had not felt in so long she almost did not recognize it. She felt like she could breathe. The stage to Dodge City was full. A cattle broker returning from business in Wichita, a Mennonite family of 4 who said very little, and a young man in a city suit who smelled powerfully of nervous perspiration. None of them paid Opal much attention, which suited her perfectly. She watched the grassland pass and thought about what came next, and tried not to think about what came before, and mostly she succeeded. Dodge City in the spring of 1878 was a town in the middle of deciding what it wanted to be. The cattle trade still ruled Front Street, and the Long Branch Saloon still poured whiskey morning to night, but there were also new storefronts and a church steeple going up, and women in proper bonnets walking the boardwalks with determined expressions. Opal arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with $34 remaining, and a growing awareness that her plan, which had been highly detailed up until Dodge City, became considerably vaguer after it. She needed another stage or a rail connection heading southwest toward Pueblo, and she needed it within 2 or 3 days at most, because she could not afford to spend money on lodging longer than that, and also because Walter would have discovered her absence by now, and she did not know whether he would come after her or simply decide that a runaway wife was an embarrassment he preferred to resolve quietly. She suspected the latter. Walter Beaumont was above all things concerned with appearances. She was standing outside the stage depot, consulting the posted schedule and doing arithmetic in her head, when she heard the sound of someone methodically hammering a loose board back onto the depot's exterior wall. She did not pay attention to this at first. Then the hammering stopped, and a voice said, plainly and without any attempt at charm, "The Colorado stage doesn't run until Thursday. 2 days." Opal turned. The man doing the hammering was crouched at the base of the wall, hammer still in his hand, looking up at her with steady gray eyes set in a face that had been lived in considerably not old, perhaps 30 or 31, with dark hair cut short and a jaw that carried a few days of dark stubble. He wore a plain work shirt and canvas trousers and boots that had seen genuine use. There was nothing showy about him at all. He was the opposite of showy. "I beg your pardon," Opal said. "The Colorado stage," he said again, nodding toward the schedule board she had been reading. "Thursday morning, 6 o'clock. I know because I drive it." Opal looked at him for a moment. "You are the driver." "Stage driver," he said. "Clarence Hudson." He did not stand to offer his hand, which would have required her to step closer, and she appreciated that he seemed to understand that a woman standing alone in a strange town with a carpet bag was not necessarily looking to close distances with strangers. Instead, he just looked at her steadily, the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand without making it feel like an examination. "Opal Ellsworth," she said. "You going all the way to Pueblo, as far as Ember Creek if the line goes there?" "It goes close enough," he said. "Stage stops at a crossroads about 4 miles east of Ember Creek. Someone from town usually comes to meet it." He stood then, straightening to his full height, which was considerable, and tucked the hammer into his belt. "You have lodging here in Dodge?" "Not yet." He considered this for a moment with no visible judgment. "Mrs. Callaghan on 2nd Street takes women boarders. She's fair about the price and she keeps a clean house. Tell her Clarence sent you." Opal studied him. He had already turned back to the wall, crouching to examine another loose board. She waited for something else, the angle, the offer he would attach to this information, the favor he would expect in return. Men did not simply offer useful information without wanting something back. That had been her experience. He did not add anything. He just found the loose board and began working the nail out so he could reset it properly. "Thank you," Opal said, after a moment. He nodded without looking up. Mrs. Callaghan's boarding house was exactly as advertised, clean, fair-priced, and run by a stout Irish woman who asked no questions and expected no conversation beyond what a guest offered willingly. Opal ate a hot supper of beef stew and corn bread and went to bed at 7 in the evening and slept, truly and deeply slept, for the first time in days. She spent Wednesday in a kind of suspended waiting. She walked the length of Front Street once, not out of curiosity, but out of the instinct that a woman in unfamiliar territory should understand her surroundings. She bought a box of biscuits and a small wedge of hard cheese from the general store to carry on the stage, because she was running careful accounting of her remaining money. She wrote a brief letter to her brother Silas in Missouri, telling him only that she was well and heading west and that he should not worry, and paid 2 cents to post it. She did not see Clarence Hudson again that day, though she was not looking for him particularly, or so she told herself. Thursday morning came cold and clear, the sky above Dodge City a deep aching blue that seemed to go on forever. Opal arrived at the stage depot at 5:30 to find 2 other passengers already waiting, a heavyset merchant named Kowalski who was transporting goods to Pueblo, and a pair of brothers, the Renner boys, who said they were going to Lamar to visit family. Clarence Hudson was checking the harness on the 4-horse team, moving around the animals with quiet efficiency. He wore a heavy canvas duster now against the morning cold, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He checked each buckle and strap with the particular attention of a man who understood that carelessness in this work had real consequences. He greeted Opal with a nod when she arrived, and something in the plainness of that greeting, no flirtation, no unnecessary examination of her appearance, settled something in her chest that she had not realized was unsettled. The stage rolled out of Dodge City as the sun came up over the flat eastern horizon, painting the grassland in copper and gold. The road west was a rutted two-track affair that the stage followed through the rolling buffalo grass, and the motion was rough enough in the first hour to make the merchant Kowalski turn distinctly green. The Renner brothers, who were young and apparently made of stronger stuff, played cards between themselves and said very little to anyone else. Opal sat with her back against the forward wall of the coach and looked out the window at the passing land. She had not been this far west before. The scale of it startled her, the openness, the lack of trees, the sky that was simply enormous and indifferent. There was something both frightening and deeply relieving about it. The land did not care who you had been, or what you had agreed to, or what small, steady erosions had been performed on you. It just went on, flat and patient, all the way to the mountains. They stopped at noon at a relay station south of the Arkansas River, where fresh horses were brought out, and a woman in a calico dress served a simple meal of salt pork and biscuits to anyone who wanted it. Clarence came down from the box to water the new horses and check the wheel hubs. Opal sat on a bench outside the relay station and ate her biscuits from her own supply, not out of thriftiness, but out of a habit of self-sufficiency she was actively cultivating. Clarence crouched nearby with a tin cup of coffee and looked out at the land to the west, where the terrain was beginning to change slightly, low swells rising from the flatness. He did not seem to feel the need to fill the quiet, and Opal found, to her slight surprise, that she did not feel the need to fill it either. "How long have you driven this run?" she asked eventually. 2 years on this line," he said. "Before that I drove for the Barlow-Sanderson out of Santa Fe." "You like it?" He seemed to consider the question genuinely. "I like that the road doesn't lie to you," he said. "The weather's the weather. The horses need what they need. You do the work right and things mostly go right." "I appreciate work that's honest that way." Opal thought about this. "I think I understand that," she said. He looked at her briefly, not with speculation, just attention. "Where are you from originally?" "Missouri, a farm outside Sedalia. I left when I was 22. He did not ask where she went after that or why she was going to Ember Creek now, and the not asking felt so profoundly respectful that she felt something shift quietly in the vicinity of her sternum. She was 25 now. The years between 22 and 25 felt like they belonged to another woman entirely. "Colorado's good country," he said. "Harder than Kansas, but more honest about it." The relay station woman came out to collect cups, and Clarence stood, draining the last of his coffee, and went back to check the new lead horses. Opal watched him work and tried to remember the last time a man had simply talked to her like she was a person worth answering plainly, and she could not remember. It disturbed her slightly, how unusual that felt. The afternoon portion of the journey took them into rougher country, the land rising and falling now, the grass shorter and tougher, the road winding through dry creek beds and low limestone cuts. Toward sunset the stage climbed a long hill, and at the top Opal saw, for the first time, the dark blue outline of the Rocky Mountains rising along the western horizon, impossibly large, impossibly far, and yet undeniably present. She pressed her face near the window and stared, and she felt something open in her chest like a door long nailed shut. They overnighted at a way station just inside the Colorado Territory border, a low adobe building with a bunkhouse attached, and a woman named Alina who ran it with iron competence. The passengers were fed and given places to sleep, women in the main house, men in the bunkhouse. Opal lay on a narrow cot and listened to the wind against the shutters and to the extraordinary quiet beyond it, the deep West Country quiet that had no city sound underneath it, and she thought about the word that kept rising in her mind: free. She did not let herself use it quite yet, because she was not yet there, and because she understood that Walter Beaumont was probably making inquiries, and because $42 minus what she had spent was now $28, and she had not yet secured the position with Mrs. Hargrove. But the word sat in her mind like an ember, banked and patient, waiting for the right conditions. The second day on the road was longer and harder. The stage climbed steadily, the air thinning slightly, the landscape changing from grassland to scrub juniper and pinyon pine, the mountains growing from a suggestion into a real and overwhelming presence to the west and north. The merchant Kowalski had recovered his color and turned out to be a surprisingly pleasant conversationalist, full of opinions on commerce and weather. The Renner brothers disembarked at Lamar midday with their bags and their card deck, and the stage continued with only Opal and Kowalski as passengers. Late in the afternoon, Clarence called down from the box that the road ahead had a washed-out section from recent rains, and that he would need to find a way around it, which would add perhaps an hour to the day. Opal put her head out the window to look. The road ahead had simply ceased to exist for about 40 feet, replaced by a red mud ravine where a spring flood had cut through. Clarence was already off the box, walking the edge of the damage, looking at the ground to the south where a shallow grade offered an alternative route. "Can we manage it?" Kowalski called. "Yes," Clarence said without drama. He walked the alternate line twice, checking the ground firmness, then came back and climbed to the box. "Hold on to something," he said calmly. He took the stage around the damage with steady, deliberate care, reading the ground, keeping the horses calm with quiet words and a steady hand on the reins. The stage tilted alarmingly at one point, the right wheels dropping into a shallow gully, and Opal gripped the window frame and did not make a sound, and then they were through, and the road continued as if nothing had happened. Kowalski let out a long breath. "Good Lord," he said. From the box, absolutely nothing. Not a word about skill or nerve or the near thing it had been. Just the steady sound of hooves on the improving road surface, and the mountains ahead. Opal found herself smiling at the window, and she did not immediately stop. The crossroads that served as the stage stop for Ember Creek was reached the following morning, the third day out of Dodge, in the middle of a light spring rain that turned the red dirt road to a brick-colored paste. Kowalski had disembarked at Pueblo the previous evening. Opal was the only remaining passenger when Clarence called down that they had reached the Ember Creek stop. She climbed out with her carpet bag and stood in the light rain and looked around. The crossroads consisted of a hitching post, a small covered bench, and a hand-lettered sign that said Ember Creek 4MI. There was no one waiting. Clarence climbed down from the box and walked around to where she stood. He looked up the road toward Ember Creek and then back at her, and for the first time she saw something in his expression that was not quite his usual steady neutrality. It was the look of a man who does not like leaving a problem unresolved. "Stage continues on to Trinidad," he said. "I can't wait." "I know," Opal said. "I'll wait for someone from town." He looked at the empty road again. "It's 4 miles," he said, and there was something carefully balanced in his tone, the awareness that offering too much help to a woman traveling alone could be read wrong, against the plain fact that leaving her in the rain at an empty crossroads was also wrong. "I'll be fine," she said, and meant it mostly. He looked at her directly then. "Mrs. Hargrove's boarding house is on the main street," he said. "White painted front, green shutters. She's a solid woman. You know her." "I stop at Ember Creek on my return run," he said. "Friday afternoon usually, if there's anyone waiting." He paused. "I'll check." It was not a promise exactly. It was stated the way he stated most things, as a plain, practical fact. But Opal felt the solidity of it, the way a steady floor feels under your feet after too long on uncertain ground. The stage pulled away and she stood at the crossroads in the rain, and she was alone and 25 years old and had $28 and a letter of introduction and a small derringer in her carpet bag. And the air smelled like juniper and wet earth and distance, and she breathed it in slowly and deliberately. A wagon came from the direction of Ember Creek 40 minutes later, driven by a lean teenage boy named Pell who said Mrs. Hargrove had expected the stage to come a day earlier and apologized for the wait. Opal climbed onto the wagon seat beside him, and they went up the road toward the mountains. And the rain stopped, and the sun came out and lit the wet scrub in 100 shades of gold and green. And the mountains ahead were close enough now that she could see the snow on their upper reaches. Ember Creek was a small town, perhaps 200 people, settled in a valley where a clear cold creek ran down from the higher country, and a stand of cottonwood trees grew in a long curving line along its bank. The main street had perhaps a dozen buildings, a general store, a livery, a small bank, a saloon called the Copper Star, a church, a doctor's office, and at the south end a two-story white building with green shutters exactly as Clarence had described. Mrs. Agnes Hargrove turned out to be a woman of perhaps 55, compact and energetic, with sharp dark eyes and a manner that was businesslike without being unkind. She read Opal's letter of introduction, asked several direct questions about her experience keeping household accounts and managing laundry and cooking for a number of people, and then offered Opal room, board, and $3 a week in wages in exchange for helping run the boarding house, which currently housed 4 long-term boarders. "When can you start?" Mrs. Hargrove asked. "I already have," Opal said, and something in her voice made the older woman smile. She was given a small room on the second floor with a window that faced east toward the lower plains and a narrow iron bed, and a washstand, and a hook on the wall for her clothes. She stood at the window for a while after Mrs. Hargrove left and looked out at the land spreading away from the mountains and tried to take the full measure of what she had done. She had walked out of a life that had been quietly consuming her for 3 years, and she had carried herself 200 miles west on $42 and a good letter, and she was still standing, and the window in front of her looked out on open country and she could breathe. She was not broken. That was what surprised her most. She had expected to feel more damage than she did. There was damage, certainly, a flinch at sudden movements, a deep reluctance to accept anything from any man that might later be used as obligation, a habit of minimizing her own preferences so thoroughly that she sometimes forgot she had them. But underneath all of that she found that Opal Ellsworth still existed, recognizable and intact, like a coin worn smooth, but still carrying its original impression. She spent the first week learning the boarding house. Mrs. Hargrove's operation was orderly but stretched thin 4 boarders, a large kitchen, 2 dining room tables, rooms to clean and linens to launder, and 3 meals a day to organize. Opal threw herself into the work with a kind of physical relief, because the work was concrete and honest, and when she did it well she could see the results plainly. There was no ambiguity to a clean floor or a well-made bed. She was good at this, better than she had expected, and Mrs. Hargrove noticed and said so with a directness that Opal found she deeply appreciated after years of having her competencies either ignored or claimed by Walter as extensions of his own good management. The 4 boarders were a varied collection. There was Mr. Pearsall, a retired mining engineer who read extensively and said very little. There was the Taggart brothers, a pair of middle-aged carpenters working on the new church construction, who ate prodigious amounts of food and went to bed early. And there was a young schoolteacher named Miss Fay Dunmore, 23 years old and originally from Ohio, who had come to Ember Creek to teach and found, upon arrival, that the schoolhouse was not yet finished, and was consequently waiting with determined patience while continuing to prepare lesson materials in her room. Fay was the first genuine friend Opal had made in years, which she realized with a pang when it happened. They fell into easy conversation over the washing up on Wednesday evening of Opal's first week, talking first about the logistics of the boarding house and then, carefully and gradually, about themselves. Fay was forthright and warm and had opinions she was not afraid to hold, and being around her felt like sunlight on a wall that had been in shadow. On Friday afternoon of that first week, Opal was in the kitchen rolling pastry dough when she heard the stage pull up on the main street. She did not move for a moment. Then she wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the front window. The Concord coach had stopped in front of the general store. Clarence Hudson was already down from the box, talking to the store owner about a delivery box on the stage's rear boot. He was in his canvas duster again, hat pushed back slightly, and there was a weariness in him that was different from the weariness she had seen on the road. This was the end-of-week weariness of a man who had put in hard days and was glad of the stopping. He handed down the delivery box and exchanged a few words with the store owner, and then he looked up the street in the direction of the boarding house. Opal stepped back from the window slightly, though she was not sure why. He came by the boarding house an hour later, while Opal was setting the dining table for supper. Mrs. Hargrove let him in and called for Opal, which made Opal feel a small and unexpected flutter that she immediately identified and held at arm's length, because she was not in the business of feeling flutters at present. She had a life to build. That came first. He was standing in the front hall with his hat in his hands when she came down the stairs, and he looked at her with that same level steadiness she remembered from the stage depot in Dodge and said, "You made it all right." "I did," she said. "Mrs. Hargrove had me working within the hour of arriving." Something that might have been a smile moved briefly across his face. "That sounds right," he said. "The crossroads were empty for a while," she said, "but the boy came. Pell, he's reliable when he gets organized about it." He turned his hat in his hands. "I wanted to make sure the stop had been made." "You checked," she said. "I said I would." There was a brief silence, and then Mrs. Hargrove appeared from the kitchen and said there was supper if Clarence wanted it. The way a woman says something she says often to someone who is a familiar fixture in her life. He declined, said he had to get the stage to the livery and check in with the relay agent, and put his hat back on and tipped it briefly to Opal. "Glad you're settled," he said. "Thank you," she said. "For the crossroads and for Mrs. Callaghan's in Dodge." He nodded, and then he was gone, and the door closed behind him, and the front hall was quiet, and Opal stood there for a moment before going back to set the table. Faye appeared at the kitchen doorway with a bowl of beans. "Who was that?" "The stage driver who brought me from Dodge," Opal said. "He was checking that I had arrived." Faye looked at the closed door thoughtfully. "Stage drivers don't usually make house calls to confirm passenger arrivals," she said. "This one was being conscientious," Opal said firmly. Faye said, in the tone of a woman who has formed an opinion but is too polite to press it. The weeks that followed were the beginning of something Opal had not had in a long time, a daily life that belonged to her. She worked hard at the boarding house, managing increasingly more of the operations as Mrs. Hargrove recognized her capabilities and delegated accordingly. She learned the names and habits of Ember Creek's residents, was courteous with everyone, and took careful stock of who in the town was trustworthy and who was not, the way a person who has been badly mistreated learns to do. She was not unfriendly. She was warm and capable and quickly became well regarded, but she kept a certain reserve about her, a private margin where she did not let anyone. Clarence Hudson came through Ember Creek every Friday on the southbound run and picked up return passengers every Monday morning heading back toward Pueblo. He began stopping at the boarding house routinely, not because he boarded there, but because Mrs. Hargrove had evidently decided long ago that the stage driver was welcome at her table when he was in town, and because Opal, being the one who set and served that table, was therefore present. They talked. It surprised her how much and how easily they talked once the conversations became regular. He was from eastern Tennessee originally, he told her, the younger son of a dirt farmer who had come west at 20 with nothing particular planned. He had worked a dozen different jobs over a decade, mining, freighting, cattle driving, ranch work, before landing the stage job, which suited him in ways he found difficult to fully articulate, but made the attempt at anyway, which she found admirable. He was 31 years old. He had never married. When she asked him once, in a cautious, sideways way, why not, he was quiet for a moment and then said that he had found most of the social architecture of courtship involved a great deal of performance that he was not well suited to, and that the women he had encountered who seemed genuinely interesting had generally been of the opinion that a stage driver without substantial property was not a viable prospect. "That seems like their loss," Opal said, and immediately wanted to put the words back in her mouth, because they sounded more personal than she had intended them. But Clarence just nodded at his coffee cup and said, "I'd come around to thinking so myself," and did not make anything of it beyond that which she respected. She told him about Missouri, about the farm and her parents and Sela's, and about moving to Wichita. She did not at first tell him much about Walter. There was no particular reason to tell a stage driver the details of her private humiliations, and besides, she was still in the process of sorting through them herself, still understanding what 3 years of being slowly reduced had done to her sense of herself. But one Friday evening in late May, when the boarding house had emptied after supper and Mrs. Hargrove had gone to bed early with a headache, Opal and Clarence sat on the front porch in the cooling air, and she told him some of it, not all, but enough. She told him about the gentle corrections in public and the management of her opinions, and the way she had stopped knowing what she thought about things, because thinking differently from Walter had consequences that were never dramatic but always exhausting. Clarence listened the way he did everything completely, without interruption, without visible judgment. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "There's more than one way to take someone apart." "Yes," she said, "there is." "You didn't let him finish the job," he said. Something about the plainness of this hit her in a way that more elaborate sympathy would not have. She felt her throat tighten and then release. "No," she said, "I didn't." "Good," he said, with the same unornamented conviction with which he said most things. They sat a while longer in the evening air, listening to the creek and the insects and the occasional sound from the Copper Star saloon down the street, and it was one of the most comfortable silences Opal had experienced in years, possibly ever. June arrived, bringing warmth and long evenings and the smell of wild grass warming in the sun. Ember Creek began to feel like a real place to Opal, not just a destination but a place where her own life had taken root. She knew the Taggarts' breakfast preferences and Mr. Pearsall's habit of reading on the back porch after supper and Faye's tendency to stay up too late writing letters to her family in Ohio. She knew which boards on the staircase creaked and where Mrs. Hargrove kept the spare candles and how to manage the temperamental kitchen stove so it didn't smoke. She knew the creek froze in deep winter, and that the mountains to the west were called the Wet Mountains, and that the town's founder, a man named Olson, had tried to establish a silver mining operation 30 years ago and failed, and left the town to figure out its own identity. She also knew, by June, that Clarence Hudson was the most genuinely honest person she had encountered since she was a child, and that this knowledge was doing something to her that she was not yet ready to name. He brought her a book once, a copy of Roughing It by Mark Twain, which he had picked up in Pueblo from a bookseller's cart. He left it on the hall table with a note that said simply her name and a question mark after it, which she took to mean that he thought she might want it. She read it in 3 evenings and found it funny and vivid, and the next Friday she said so, and the conversation that followed was the longest they had yet had, ranging from Twain to the nature of the West to what it meant to go looking for something and find something entirely different. "Is that what you're doing?" he asked. "Looking for something?" She thought about it honestly. "I think I'm recovering something," she said, "which might be different." He nodded slowly. "Like finding out what's still there after a fire." "Yes," she said, a little startled by the precision of it, "exactly like that." He looked at his hands on the porch railing and said, "For what it's worth, what I can see looks like a great deal." She did not respond immediately. The evening air was soft and blue, and the creek made its constant patient sound below the cottonwoods. Then she said quietly, "That means a good deal coming from you." He looked at her then, and there was something in his gray eyes that was not his usual steady observation. It was warmer than that, more specific, and it was directed at her with a directness that she felt from the crown of her head to the soles of her feet. Then he looked away, and the moment passed, or perhaps it did not pass so much as settle somewhere, the way a stone settles to the bottom of clear water and stays there, visible and still. The trouble with Walter arrived in July. Opal should have expected it and in fact had been preparing for it in the back of her mind since leaving Wichita, because Walter Beaumont was not a man who liked unresolved accounts, and a wife who had left was an unresolved account. But the actual arrival of a hired man from Wichita asking questions on Front Street in Ember Creek was still an unpleasant shock, the kind that wakes up all the old fear responses that have been sleeping. She saw him from the boarding house window on a Tuesday morning, talking to the man who ran the general store. He was a lean, rodent-faced individual in a town suit, clearly from somewhere with more resources than Ember Creek, and he was showing something to the store owner, a paper or a photograph. She could not tell from this distance. Her first response was a cold, clenching fear. Her second response was anger at herself for having the fear. Her third response, following quickly after the second, was the cold, clear assessment of what she needed to do. She went downstairs and found Mrs. Hargrove in the kitchen. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need to ask for your help." Mrs. Hargrove set down the wooden spoon she was holding and gave Opal her full attention. Opal explained briefly and without excessive detail. She had left a bad marriage in Wichita, and it appeared her husband had sent someone looking for her. She explained that she had not been mistreated in ways that left marks but had been mistreated in ways that had nearly made her disappear. She explained that she had no intention of going back. Mrs. Hargrove listened. Then she said, "What does this man want, do you think? Your return?" "Walter would want the appearance managed," Opal said. "I don't think he would drag me back by force, but he might try legal pressure. Kansas law would consider me an absent wife." "Colorado is not Kansas," Mrs. Hargrove said with particular firmness. She picked the wooden spoon back up. "You work here. You are employed and established. If this man comes to my door, I will tell him I have no information for him, which will be the truth since I don't know what he's been told to look for." Opal felt something loosen in her chest. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Mrs. Hargrove said. "Just go about your morning normally." She tried to. She was beating a rug on the back porch an hour later when Faye appeared at the back door and said that a man was at the front asking to speak to the proprietress about a woman who might be boarding here. Opal set the rug beater down carefully. "Was he given any information?" "Mrs. Hargrove is handling him," Faye said, and her voice was completely composed, which Opal recognized as the same quality she herself had in a crisis, the ability to be entirely calm while furious on the inside. The hired man left the boarding house having apparently received nothing useful and was next seen going into the saloon, and by afternoon he had left town on the road back east. Opal watched him go from the upstairs window of the boarding house and waited to feel relief, and mostly felt a residual tightness in her stomach that she knew would take a while to leave. Clarence came through that Friday, and she told him what had happened, because she found that she wanted to, and also because she thought he ought to know, in case the hired man returned or sent someone else. She was sitting across from him at the kitchen table, Mrs. Hargrove elsewhere in the house, and she told it plainly and without elaborating on the fear more than was necessary. When she finished, Clarence was very still. Not in the way of a man who doesn't care, but in the way of a man who is careful about what he does with his feelings. Then he said, "He won't be the last, most likely. A man like that doesn't accept unresolved things. I know. You need a plan if he sends someone again." "Mrs. Hargrove has been a fortress," Opal said. "She is," he said. "But a legal avenue," he stopped, choosing words. "If there were some legal change in your circumstances, it would make it harder for him to have any claim." Opal looked at him steadily. She knew what he was circling around. The legal change that would remove a husband's claim on a wife was either his death or a divorce, and divorce in 1878 was neither simple nor socially comfortable, particularly for the wife. Colorado Territory had slightly more permissive divorce statutes than Kansas, but it still required grounds and time and legal fees she was not sure she could afford. "I've been looking into the territorial law," she said. "Desertion is grounds after 1 year. I left in March, so next March." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, with the particular care of a man who knows the weight of what he is about to say, "And after that." She looked at him. The kitchen was full of the late afternoon light that came through the west window, and it lay across the table between them, warm and golden and very still. "After that," she said slowly, "I suppose I'll see what my life looks like when it's fully mine." He held her gaze. "I'd like to be part of that picture," he said, "if you'd have it that way, no pressure and no condition to the saying of it." The directness of it made her breath catch. She had expected the feeling she was developing to remain subterranean for much longer, expected months, more of careful distance, while she finished the process of becoming herself again. But here he was, not pushing or maneuvering, just stating a plain truth with his gray eyes steady and his hands flat on the table, and the plain truth of it matched the plain truth that was growing in her own chest. "I would like that very much," she said quietly, "but I need time to finish what I started. Coming here, building this, becoming someone who chooses freely. Do you understand that?" "Completely," he said without hesitation. "Then yes," she said, "I'd like you to be part of it." He nodded, and the thing that crossed his face then was not a smile exactly. It was more like what happens in a room when someone opens a window. Something that had been contained expanded very slightly and was better for it. The summer deepened around them. Opal continued her work at the boarding house, and Clarence continued his stage route, Dodge City to Pueblo and back, Fridays and Mondays in Ember Creek. But the nature of their time together shifted in the way that nature shifts between late spring and full summer, imperceptibly while it's happening, utterly clear in retrospect. They took walks along the creek on Friday evenings when the work was done. They talked about everything and nothing. The books she was reading and the road conditions he navigated, and the quality of the horses he was given at different relay stations, and what she thought about the prospects for Ember Creek, and whether the new church steeple would actually be finished before winter. He brought her small things from his runs, a bag of better coffee from the Pueblo market, a packet of needles she had mentioned the general store was out of, a bright copper-red stone he had picked up from a road cut, because the color had made him think of the way the setting sun hit the boarding house windows. She kept the stone on the windowsill in her room, which she decided not to analyze too closely. He was quietly attentive in a way that was entirely different from Walter's management. Where Walter had controlled, Clarence noticed. Where Walter had corrected, Clarence considered. He asked her opinions and then actually engaged with them, argued with them sometimes, in the alive and respectful way of a man who believes the person across from him has a mind worth arguing with. He remembered things she had said weeks ago and referenced them later. He noticed when she was tired without making it into a drama or a deficit. Once in August, he was in town overnight because a wheel had cracked on the stage and required a day's repair, and he helped Opal and Mrs. Hargrove move a heavy dresser from one room to another. And while they were maneuvering the thing through a narrow doorway, they both said the same unhelpful suggestion at the same moment, and then looked at each other and laughed, really laughed, the kind that takes you by surprise and runs on longer than you expect. And Mrs. Hargrove appeared in the hallway to see what the trouble was and shook her head and went back to her kitchen with the expression of a woman who has understood something. In September, Walter Beaumont sent another person. This one was a lawyer, which was more alarming than the hired man had been. He arrived on the Tuesday stage and presented himself at the boarding house with a brief letter stating that he represented Walter Beaumont of Wichita, Kansas, and requesting to speak with Mrs. Opal Beaumont if she was in residence. Mrs. Hargrove told him without any change in expression that she had no boarder by that name, that her boarders were known to her by the names they provided, and she had no obligation to speculate about their prior circumstances. But Opal had already spoken with Mrs. Hargrove about this possibility. And she had, 2 weeks ago, taken the stage to Pueblo and visited the offices of a territorial lawyer named Mr. Vasquez, who had explained the Colorado divorce statutes to her in detail, and had accepted her retained payment of $7, almost everything she had saved beyond basic necessity, to begin the preliminary paperwork on the grounds of spousal absence, to be formally filed in March. She told the Beaumont lawyer, through the closed door of Mrs. Hargrove's front parlor, exactly what she had done. She told him that she was aware of her rights under Colorado territorial law, that she had retained counsel, and that she was prepared to pursue the matter through proper legal channels. She told him that she had left Walter Beaumont's household of her own volition and had no intention of returning, and that if Walter wished to resolve the matter without difficulty, a cooperative approach would serve both parties better than a contentious one, given that Colorado courts had some latitude in matters of cruelty that did not leave physical marks. This last part was a slight improvisation. Mr. Vasquez had told her such arguments existed, but were difficult to prove. She said it anyway because she had learned, in 3 years of navigating Walter's very specific form of control, exactly how much he did not want his behavior examined publicly. The lawyer was quiet for a moment, and then said that he would convey her communication to his client. He was gone by the next morning. Clarence was in Pueblo when all this happened, but she told him on Friday, and he listened to it from beginning to end with the contained stillness that was his usual way, and at the end he said, "You handled that about as well as it could be handled." "I was terrified the entire time," she said. "I know," he said. "That's what makes it impressive." She looked at him and thought, not for the first time, that she had not known it was possible to feel this safe with another person, this plainly and honestly safe, without the safety being a performance or a condition or something he was doing to her rather than with her. She was not fully healed from Walter. She knew that. There were still moments when she heard a certain tone of voice and felt herself contract, when she second-guessed herself in ways that had nothing to do with the actual situation, when the habit of minimizing kicked in before she could stop it. Healing was not a single event or a single moment of declaration. It was the daily accumulation of choosing differently, of taking up space again, of learning what she actually thought and felt and wanted. But she was in the middle of it and moving, and that was what mattered. October brought the aspens on the high slopes turning golden, and the light over the valley became the particular clear slanted gold of the mountain autumn that seemed to make every ordinary thing beautiful. Opal stood at her east-facing window one morning before breakfast and watched the light coming across the lower plains toward the mountains, and felt, completely and without qualification, that she was glad to be alive and glad to be exactly here and not anywhere else. Clarence had been talking with a man in Ember Creek about a piece of land outside town, 20 acres along a bend of the creek, good water and some timber, and a house frame that had been started by a previous owner who had then moved on to Nevada. He had mentioned it to Opal once carefully, saying that he was thinking about whether it was time to stop driving and put down roots somewhere, that he was 31 years old, and the stage road was a good life, but perhaps not the whole life. He had said this looking out at the mountains, not at her, and she had understood that he was not asking her anything directly. He was simply thinking out loud in her presence, which was its own kind of intimacy. She had said, also looking at the mountains, that Ember Creek seemed like as good a place as any to put roots down, and that she intended to stay here herself, long-term, assuming things continued as they were going. And he had said that was good to know, in his quiet way, and they had left it there for the time being. In November, a letter arrived for Opal from Walter's lawyer in Wichita, stating that Walter Beaumont had agreed to a cooperative approach to the dissolution of the marriage, and would not contest the Colorado proceedings. She read the letter 3 times, standing at the kitchen table with Mrs. Hargrove watching her, and then she set it down and pressed her hands flat on the table and let out a long, slow breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. "Well," Mrs. Hargrove said. "Well," Opal said, and then she laughed, and then she cried for about 2 minutes, and then she dried her eyes and helped Mrs. Hargrove start the supper rolls. She wrote to Silas in Missouri that evening, a longer letter than usual, telling him as much as she could about what the last months had been. She told him she was working and safe and more herself than she had been in years. She told him about Ember Creek and the mountains and the creek and Mrs. Hargrove. She told him, carefully but honestly, that there was a person here she cared about very much, a stage driver named Clarence Hudson, who was the most quietly reliable man she had ever met, and that things were going in a good direction. Silas wrote back 3 weeks later, a letter that made her cry in the best possible way. He said he was glad she had gotten out. He said he had known for a long time that things were not right and had not known what to do about it. He said that if this Clarence Hudson made her happy, then he trusted her judgment entirely, and he looked forward to meeting him someday. She left the letter on the windowsill next to the copper-red stone. The winter closed in around Ember Creek in late November with the particular sudden intimacy of mountain winters, the snow coming to the high peaks first, and then working down through the weeks, until it reached the valley and filled it with a white, deep quiet. The stage route became harder going in deep winter. Clarence switched the coach to a more rugged winter rig and reduced his speed, and the Monday and Friday runs sometimes shifted by a day depending on road conditions. On a Friday afternoon in December, with snow falling steadily outside and the boarding house warm with the smell of wood smoke and soup, Clarence arrived covered in snow and considerably later than expected because of a drift across the road south of town. Mrs. Hargrove took his coat and hat and stood them by the kitchen stove and put a bowl of soup in front of him without ceremony, the way she did things. Opal sat across from him with her own tea and watched him eat and thought that she had been watching this man eat soup and drink coffee and sit in various chairs for 8 months now, and that each time she looked at him she felt the same thing, a kind of opening, a relaxation of some vigilance she had not known she was constantly maintaining, a sense that the world was, at this particular moment, arranged correctly. He looked up and found her looking at him, and he set the spoon down and said, "What?" "Nothing," she said. "You've got something on your mind," he said. "I have a great deal on my mind, I usually do," but she was smiling slightly. "I was thinking about the spring." "What about it?" "About Mr. Vasquez filing the papers in March," she said, "and about what comes after." He was very still, and it was the particular stillness of a man who is attending carefully. "What about it?" She put her teacup down. She had been practicing being direct. It was part of the recovery, the reclaiming of her own voice. "I think you should buy the land along the creek," she said. "If it's still available, I think you should buy it, and I think you should stay in Ember Creek." He looked at her for a long moment. "Is that so?" "Yes," she said. "And I think after the spring, after the legal part is done, and I've had the full year to be myself without any of it hanging over me, I would be glad if you asked me to marry you. If that was something you wanted to do." The words sat in the warm kitchen air between them. Opal felt her heart beating in a way she was fully present to, not the anxious hammering of fear, but the clean, strong beat of a person standing in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment, saying exactly the right thing. Clarence's expression did what it sometimes did, opened, very slightly, the way that window opens in a room. Something in him that was usually carefully tended simply became visible. He said, "I was going to ask you first." "I know," she said, "but I'm done waiting for permission to want things." Something warm moved through his eyes, something that was entirely for her. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, which he had never done before. He had always been careful about the territory of her body, respectful of the margin she kept, understanding without being told what she was still working through. The touch was deliberate and gentle, and she felt it all the way up her arm and into her chest, and she did not pull away. She turned her hand over and held his back. "The land along the creek," he said. "I'll see about it Monday." "Good," she said. He held her hand for a long moment, and then he said quietly, "I have been careful about loving you." "I know," she said. "I didn't want to crowd you." "You didn't," she said. "You were the first person in years who gave me room to breathe, and I breathed, and it turned out I still knew how." He was quiet for a while, and then he said, "I love you, Opal," with the same plain conviction that characterized everything he said, as if the truth of it was simply too obvious to require ornamentation. She felt the words settle into her the way the good things had been settling into her since coming to Ember Creek, slowly and honestly and permanently. "I love you," she said. "I've known it for a while." The winter snow fell outside, and the stove ticked in the quiet kitchen, and the soup had gone cold in his bowl, and neither of them moved for a long time. He bought the 20 acres along the creek in January. The seller, a man named Croft who was old and ready to stop worrying about property, took a reasonable price and shook hands with Clarence in front of the general store on a bright cold morning. Clarence told Opal about it that evening on the boarding house porch, both of them bundled in coats against the winter air, their breath making small clouds. "The house frame needs considerable work," he said. "2 walls and a floor but no roof." "Can you do the work yourself?" "Most of it. The Taggarts could help with the framing if they're willing." "They are," Opal said, with the confidence of someone who had spent months feeding and conversing with the Taggart brothers and knew their natures completely. "They'll do it for good meals and fair company." He looked at her. "You've already thought about this." "I've thought about many things," she said, and the quiet pleasure in her own voice surprised her, the pleasure of being someone who thought and planned and moved through the world with intention, of being Opal Ellsworth and no one else, fully and without apology. February was long and cold, and the snow was deep, but the work on Clarence's land began in the brief clear days between storms. The Taggarts, true to Opal's prediction, were enthusiastic collaborators, and Mr. Pearsall, who turned out to have structural engineering in his background after all those mining years, contributed surprising expertise to the matter of the roof line. Faye, who came to visit the building site once and stood in the roofless frame and turned slowly in a circle looking at the creek through the open walls, said it was going to be beautiful, which it was beginning to be. Opal came out to the land on Saturdays, bringing food in a cloth bag and helping where she could, and the act of watching something being built deliberately and patiently, piece by piece, from a bare frame into something that would shelter actual life, felt resonant in ways she could have explained if anyone had asked her. March came, and the snow began to soften at the creek edges, and Mr. Vasquez filed the divorce papers in the territorial court. It took 6 weeks, which was faster than Opal had expected, helped considerably by Walter's cooperative stance and Vasquez's efficient management of the proceedings. The decree arrived in mid-April, a formal document with an official seal, stating that the marriage between Walter Beaumont and Opal Ellsworth, she had given her maiden name to the court, was dissolved. She read it at the kitchen table with Mrs. Hargrove and Faye present, both of whom had waited with her in the shared understanding of women who have seen what certain kinds of freedom cost. "It's done," she said. Mrs. Hargrove poured 3 small glasses of brandy from the bottle she kept for medicinal purposes and handed one to each of them and said, "To Opal Ellsworth." "To Opal Ellsworth," Faye repeated with great feeling. Opal held the glass for a moment and looked at the document with the official seal and thought about the woman who had climbed out of a second-floor hotel window in Wichita 13 months ago with $42 and a carpet bag and a derringer and a guttering belief that she was more than what she had been allowed to be. That woman had been right. She had been completely, entirely right. She drank the brandy and felt it warm her from the inside and smiled, and it was the kind of smile that belongs entirely to the person wearing it. She told Clarence that evening. He was in town for the Friday run, and they walked along the creek in the softening April air, the first real evening warmth of the season rising from the earth, the cottonwoods putting out their first faint green, the creek running loud and cold with snowmelt. He stopped walking and turned to her when she told him, and held her hands in both of his and looked at her with those steady gray eyes and said nothing for a moment, just looked at her, and she felt entirely and completely seen, the whole of her, not a managed version, not a performed version, but the actual Opal Ellsworth who had fought to come back to herself and who had made it. "Now," he said. "Now," she agreed. He had been carrying something in his coat pocket for 3 weeks, which he would later tell her, explaining that he had been waiting for the right moment with the same patience he applied to everything. He reached into his pocket and produced a plain gold ring, not a particularly fancy ring, because Clarence Hudson was not a particularly fancy man, but it was solid gold, and it had been made by a jeweler in Pueblo, and it fit her finger exactly right when he slid it on, because he had asked Mrs. Hargrove months ago to quietly find out the size. "Opal Ellsworth," he said, with the ring on her finger and his hand still around hers and the creek loud and the evening sky above them the precise shade of blue that the Colorado sky achieves in April. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "Unreservedly, absolutely yes." He kissed her then, for the first time, carefully, and with a quality of attention that made her understand that this was a man who would always be fully present to her, who would never look through her or past her or over her head, who would always, when she needed it, simply be there quiet and steady and entirely real. She kissed him back with the full force of who she was and had reclaimed herself to be, and the cottonwoods rustled in the creek wind, and the April evening settled around them like a benediction. They were married in June at the Ember Creek Church, in the building the Taggarts had finished constructing only 2 months before. Mrs. Hargrove stood as witness. Fay stood beside Opal in a cheerful blue dress, unable to keep the smile off her face. Silas Ellsworth had managed to come all the way from Missouri, arriving by train to Pueblo and by stage to Ember Creek, Clarence's stage, which had struck them both as fitting, and he shook Clarence's hand in front of the church with the particular intensity of a brother who has been worried for a long time and is now relieved down to his bones. "She wrote to me about you," Silas told Clarence. "What did she say?" Clarence asked. "That you were the quietest, honest man she had ever met," Silas said. "That she could breathe around you." Clarence thought about this. "That's the finest thing anyone has said to me," he said. "The ceremony was simple and true." The minister was a recent arrival in Ember Creek named Reverend Marsh, who had a good plain manner, and he read the words and Opal and Clarence said theirs with a directness that matched their nature, looking at each other throughout with the clear, uncomplicated attention of two people who have chosen carefully and are at peace with the choice. When it was done and they walked out of the church into the June sunlight, Opal took Clarence's arm and looked up the valley at the mountains and felt the whole of her life rearranged into something that made sense. The way a sentence with the words in the wrong order makes sense only when they are finally placed correctly. The house along the creek was ready by August. The roof was solid and the floors were good plank pine, and the windows faced east and west so that the morning light came in one side and the evening light the other, and there was a kitchen with a proper stove and a front room with a fireplace and 2 bedrooms upstairs. Clarence had built the kitchen shelves himself, measuring twice and cutting once, with the thoroughness he brought to everything. Opal had sewn curtains from a length of blue-checked cotton she had found at the Pueblo dry goods store, and they hung in every window and moved in the summer breeze, and made the rooms feel inhabited and warm. On the first morning they woke in the house, Opal lay in the early light listening to the creek through the open window and to Clarence's even breathing beside her, and thought that this specific arrangement of sound and light and safety and person was what she had been moving toward when she climbed out that Wichita window. Not this house or this valley specifically, because she had not known they existed, but this feeling, the settled, unguarded, breathing certainty of being exactly where she was supposed to be. He woke and found her awake and lay looking at the ceiling for a moment and then said, "Morning." "Morning," she said. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in my entire life," she said, with complete honesty. He turned his head on the pillow and looked at her with the quiet warmth that she had first seen across a kitchen table in December, and that she now understood would be there every morning of her life, steadily and without theater, just present. "Good," he said, and it meant everything. Clarence drove the Ember Creek stage route through the end of that year, but by the following spring he had formally ended his stage contract. He had been offered and accepted the position of town marshal in Ember Creek, which had grown enough by 1879 to need one. It was work that suited him in the same way the stage route had suited him, honest work with clear requirements, where doing it right had real consequences. He was fair and he was thorough, and he was calm in the particular way that prevents situations from escalating. And the town found him to be exactly what it needed, which is a man who doesn't want the power for the feeling of having it, but simply for the good it can do. Opal continued at the boarding house through the spring of 1880, working a reduced schedule after she discovered, on a cold November morning in 1879, that she was expecting a child. Mrs. Hargrove's response to this news was to immediately begin planning a larger schedule adjustment and to personally oversee the acquisition of everything the nursery might require from the Pueblo mail-order catalog, with the focused energy of a woman who had no grandchildren of her own and intended to adopt this situation thoroughly. The baby arrived in the late spring of 1880 in the house along the creek, attended by the town's doctor and by both Mrs. Hargrove and Fay, who had remained in Ember Creek where the schoolhouse had finally been completed and she had been teaching for 2 years. Silas had been informed by letter and was in an agony of happy anticipation in Missouri. It was a boy. They named him Henry Samuel Hudson Henry for no reason except that it suited him, which they both felt certain of the moment they saw him, and Samuel for Clarence's father, who had died the winter before, and to whom Clarence had felt the particular quiet grief of a man who has understood his father best in retrospect. Opal held Henry in the long afternoon light of the bedroom window and felt Clarence sit beside her on the bed, his arm around her, looking down at this small, furious person who had arrived with strong opinions and a remarkable amount of dark hair. And she said, "Hello, Henry," with the complete simplicity of a woman who has nothing to perform and no one to perform it for. Henry regarded her from underneath his extraordinary hair with the unfocused intensity of the newborn, and Clarence made a sound that she recognized immediately as laughter trying to happen in a man who was also extremely close to crying. And she leaned into him and felt his arm tighten around her, and the creek made its patient sound through the window, and the mountains were there where they always were, and nothing about the present moment was anything less than entirely right. Fay stood in the doorway and said, "He looks exactly like Clarence," which was true, and which Clarence received with a visible and unguarded pleasure that made Opal love him in a way that was entirely its own, distinct from all the ways she had loved him before. Silas came to visit that summer, the second visit he had made to Ember Creek since the wedding, and he held Henry with the careful reverence of a man who had been a good and gentle person his entire life, and was now being allowed to demonstrate that quality in its most obvious form. He stayed 2 weeks, long enough to help Clarence put in a kitchen garden and to eat approximately 3 times as much food as any reasonable person could explain, and when he left on the Monday stage he embraced Opal on the street in front of the boarding house and said in her ear, "You did it, little sister. You came back to yourself." She held him hard and said, "I did." He went up to the stage box where Clarence was waiting for the final passenger count and shook his hand again, the second of what would become a long series of handshakes between these two men who loved the same woman differently and completely. And then he was gone east, and the stage rolled out of Ember Creek into the August morning. The years moved with the particular quality that good years have, full of days that seem ordinary as they happen, and are recognized as extraordinary in the having of them later. Clarence's work as marshal gave Ember Creek a stability that allowed the town to grow, carefully, into itself. The church was solid and used. The school ran with Faye's firm and creative management. The boarding house expanded by a room and a half under Mrs. Hargrove's direction, and Opal continued to help there part-time in the way of a woman who genuinely loved the work and loved the older woman who ran it. Henry grew into a boy who was, in Opal's entirely unbiased assessment, the most interesting child in the valley. He had Clarence's steady gray eyes and capacity for quiet observation, and Opal's quickness of mind and willingness to say the true thing, and he moved through his small world with a concentrated seriousness that broke periodically into a laugh that lit the room. He was 5 years old when Opal discovered, with a feeling of deep and uncomplicated joy, that she was expecting again. This time the baby arrived in the winter of 1885, in the same room with the same window facing the creek, with the same doctor and Mrs. Hargrove and Faye in attendance, and this time it was a girl. They named her Clara Agnes Hudson Clara because it was simply right, and Agnes for Mrs. Hargrove, who was told this at the earliest possible opportunity, and had to excuse herself to the kitchen for several minutes before returning with perfectly composed red eyes and a businesslike declaration that she had opinions about blanket thickness in winter that she intended to voice. Henry, who was 5 and had been awaiting this development with a mixture of excitement and suspicion, regarded his sister in Opal's arms and then said, with the directness he had inherited from both parents, "She is smaller than I expected." "She will not always be," Opal said. He considered this. "All right," he said, with the philosophical acceptance of a child who has been treated always as a person worth engaging seriously. Clara Agnes Hudson grew up alongside the creek and the cottonwoods and the mountains that Opal had first seen as a distant blue suggestion from a rattling stagecoach window. And she was the kind of child who picked up stones from the creek bed and examined them with great attention, which she had learned from the copper-red stone on her mother's windowsill that had no explanation attached to it until she was old enough to ask, and then had the best explanation of any object in the house. Faye Dunmore married the Ember Creek doctor in 1887, a quiet, cheerful man named Dr. Webb, who had come to town 2 years earlier and fallen head over heels within the first month and spent another year working up to the question. Opal was her witness, as Faye had been hers, and the symmetry pleased them both enormously. Mrs. Agnes Hargrove remained at the helm of the boarding house until she was 63, at which point she handed the management to a capable young woman she had been training for the purpose, and retired to a comfortable arrangement that involved mainly reading, voicing opinions, and presiding over Sunday dinners that Opal and Clarence hosted along the creek with the regularity and warmth of a family gathering, because that was what it was. In the autumn of 1889, Colorado became the 38th state of the United States of America, and Ember Creek celebrated with a bonfire and a considerable quantity of the Copper Star's best whiskey and speeches from the mayor and the reverend and various others. And Clarence, who was still serving as marshal, and had declined every suggestion that he run for something higher because higher was not what he wanted, stood at the edge of the bonfire with Henry beside him. Henry was 9 now, and would not have missed this for anything. And Opal found him there and stood beside him and watched the fire and the celebration and the mountains above it all, dark and permanent against the October sky. "We've been here 11 years, she said. 11 and a half, he said. She looked at him, the lines around his eyes deeper now, the dark hair threaded with gray, the solidity of him entirely unchanged and entirely hers. She thought about the depot in Dodge City in the spring of 1878, a woman with $42 and a plan that ended at Dodge and a carpet bag and a burning need to simply breathe, and a man crouching at the base of a wall with a hammer and steady gray eyes, and a willingness to offer information with nothing expected back. "I'm glad you were fixing that board," she said. He looked at her with the particular smile that was entirely his, not the general-purpose smile but the one that appeared only for her, that had been appearing only for her for 11 years and that she had never once stopped being glad to see. "I've been meaning to ask," he said. "Did you ever actually need Mrs. Callaghan's in Dodge, or would you have sorted it out on your own?" "I would have sorted it out on my own," she said. "But I didn't have to, and that mattered." "That's what I thought," he said, and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him the way she had learned to lean into truly solid things, without reservation, without calculation, simply because they were there and strong and entirely real. Henry, to their left, was demanding to know from a friend of his whether the fire was technically the biggest fire in Ember Creek history, and pursuing this question with rigorous empirical interest. The bonfire crackled and the mountain stood, and the creek ran on its same patient course that it had run before they arrived and would run after. The town around them was alive and growing and real, and the life they had built along the creek was alive and real, and Opal Ellsworth Hudson was 36 years old and stood in the warm circle of a bonfire in a free state in the Rocky Mountain West with her husband and her son and her daughter asleep at home in the good house, and she was more completely herself than she had ever been. And she was loved for exactly that. And she breathed freely, fully, and with no permission required from anyone. She had escaped a life that had nearly swallowed her. She had come to a place that had room for her whole self. She had found a man who was quiet enough that she could hear her own thoughts again, gentle enough that she could lower her guard without it being used against her, steady enough that she could build something lasting alongside him. And she had done it herself, 200 miles west on $42, and a good letter, and a guttering conviction that she was worth more than she had been given. And the fact that she had found love in the doing of it was not a replacement for that self-made freedom, but its finest companion. The bonfire burned high, and the people of Ember Creek celebrated their state and their lives and their mountain valley, and Opal and Clarence stood together in the middle of it all. And nothing in their world was unresolved or uncertain or owed to anyone it should not have been owed to, and they were home.